welcome everybody to the 4th edition of the Nelson Mandela Lecture. Time now to listen to our second fantastic speaker, born in Zimbabwe. She is living partly in South Africa and right now partly in the States, where she's studying for her PhD at Harvard University. Multiple award-winning, she's written books, innumerable articles in newspapers, in magazines. She's a pundit. She makes me feel very inadequate. Please give it up for Panashe Chigumadzi.
You do not say sorry with your mouth. Our historical consciousness of African moral law demands that we ask the Dutch, the French, the British, the Portuguese, the Germans, and all our other enslavers and colonizers, Nixolisa Ngani, with what are you apologizing? This is the core of our African restorative justice and jurisprudence. As Black people, we ask, Nixolisa Ngani, with what are you apologizing? Because it is understood the material makes manifest the spirit of intent. Reparations enfleshes the spirit of atonement in our modern, or rather our material world. Nixolisa Ngani is a question that demands that our enslavers and colonizers open their hands and show us the substance of their apologies. We must be clear. Reparations will require nothing less than the end of this world as we know it. To demand reparation is to demand remembrance. To repair is to remember is to know how we arrived here. It is to have a historical memory of the past, present, and the future. And so, let us begin at the beginning. Transatlantic slavery is the material and metaphysical womb of the modern world. Our former enslavers and colonizers know this all too well, and it is for this reason that they will refuse to open their hands and go beyond so-called regrets and apologies and give reparations. To give reparations is to end the world, to turn upside down everything that this 600-year-old modern world system is built upon. To demand reparation is to confront the terrifying reality that everything in our material and metaphysical worlds will have to change. Slavery is the womb of the modern world. No less a figure than Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism, declared in The Wealth of Nations that the discovery of America in 1492 and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. In the 19th century, Marx and Engels repeated Smith's claim in the Communist Manifesto, declaring that these twin events, the discovery of the so-called New World and the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope, gave to navigation, commerce, and industry a monstrous impulse never before seen in the history of the world. And yet, what Smith, Marx, and Engels neglect to name is the ghost in the wondrous machine of modernity, the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery is the material womb of the modern world. At the very center of the new worlding that unworlded us as Black peoples was the Dutch East India Company. Less than a decade after the first Dutch slave ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the VOC was founded in 1602. This first multinational monstrosity was the first to link the East and the West and pioneered the global slave trade. In so doing, the VOC became the 17th century's richest and most powerful company. For most of the Dutch Golden Age, the VOC monopolized the transatlantic slave trade, providing the finance and technology that enabled their fellow English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese enslavers to establish their own slave-based empires. As the world's first multinational corporation, the accounting ledgers of the Dutch East India Company lay bare the fact that the term racial capitalism is in fact a tautology. Capitalism is always racializing. Racialization is always capitalizing. What is capitalism, after all, if not a system for sorting who is most fit for exploitation and extraction? Slavery is a metaphysical womb of the modern world. In 1637, the year the Dutch accelerated the global trade in African bodies by conquering the Portuguese slave markets of Elmina Castle, Sao Tome, and Luanda, René Descartes, the central Dutch Golden Age intellectual and father of modern Western philosophy, pronounced its first principle. I think, therefore I am. Far from emerging in a historical vacuum, the Cartesian mind-body dualism was birthed alongside the rise of the transatlantic trade in African bodies. And so it constructed the precondition for reason and rationality in modern Western philosophy as bodilessness. From there on, Descartes' dictum, I think, therefore I am, constructed the reasoning and rational subject against the non-reasoning and irrational enslaved embodied black, who, according to the likes of Hegel, Kant, Hume, and even Nietzsche, was situated outside of history, moral law, and consciousness. Thus, reason and rationality was structured by anti-blackness from the very start. The White Fathers thus declared in oppositional terms, we think because the other does not. We are because the other is not. The master is because the slave is not. With the rise of the transatlantic trade, the European metaphysical world deemed all people of African descent as having no claims to bodily integrity, territory, or sovereignty because we have no claims to reason, rationality, morality, and ontological legitimacy that the master is bound to respect. We see this in the Cape Dutch settlers' dismissal of the moral and political arguments put forth by conquered indigenous leaders in the aftermath of the 1659 Khoi Dutch War, South Africa's first major war of resistance to slaver-settler modernity. The Khoi leaders, several of whom, such as Namoa, had traveled to other parts of the Dutch slave trading empire, objected to Dutch land conquest by invoking their indigenous claims to land and sovereignty based in African jurisprudence. They asked, and I quote, "If we Africans were to come to Holland, would we be permitted to act in a similar manner as you act here?" Close quote. The conquered Khoi leaders continued to try and reason with the settlers, demanding, open quote, "Who then, with the greatest degree of justice, can be required to give way? The natural owners or the foreign invader?" Close quote. Exacerbated by their insistence on their sovereignty, Jan van Riebeeck, the Dutch East India Company official who established Cape Town as a refreshment station in 1652, responded that he was not bound to respect their laws and claims to territory because their land had been, in his words, won by the sword. Thus, claiming his European right of conquest, which had its genesis in the 1493 Papal Bull, which authorized the Spanish conquest of America, Van Riebeeck deemed all indigenous land, no matter where it be, empty land for theirs to take. The moral law and reasoning of the masters thus superseded those of the enslaved and the colonized. This world cannot imagine itself outside of this master-slave dialectic. It is this dialectic that has propelled the history of modern struggle. In many ways, South African history, from Vasco da Gama's landing at the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 to apartheid's fall in 1994, frames the history of modern social and political struggles between slaver and enslaved, colonizer and colonized, capital and labor. Because of its historical and geopolitical constitution, among them, its strategic location as the midpoint between East and West, its vast concentration in minerals, and its temperate climate, history's extremities have coalesced at Africa's southernmost end. It is no accident that South Africa is today's most unequal society. Born in the womb of Cape Dutch slavery, South Africa's history grew to embody more intensely than most the violent consequences of the benefits of a white settler minority linked to Europe and the misfortunes of a black indigenous majority linked to Africa. It is for this reason that Stuart Hall famously asserted, South Africa is a world historic limit case in the theoretical sense and a test case in the political sense. And thus, apartheid South Africa staged the most compelling political drama of the 20th century. It's no surprise then that global whiteness held its breath in anticipation of a night of long knives for white South Africa on the eve of black majority rule. Instead, Mandela's South Africa gave a world at the end of history a miracle, a rainbow bending towards justice. Mandela's post-apartheid miracle seemingly absolved global whiteness of its sins. After 1994's negotiated settlement secured black political rights with the protection of white property rights, Mandela's post-apartheid government mandated the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. South Africa would not go the Nuremberg way. South Africa would go to church. Presided over by a purple-robed Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the world held the post-apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission as the exemplar of overcoming history and achieving global racial reconciliation. As he presided over the TRC, Archbishop Tutu thrust Ubuntu, the African philosophy best understood through the concept Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, a person is a person through other people, into the global imagination. Describing the rationale for amnesty at the TRC as rooted in Ubuntu, Tutu said, African jurisprudence is restorative rather than retributive. Close quote. And yet, Tutu's theology of grace and forgiveness was grounded in what his former comrade and colleague, Reverend Alan Busak, later critiqued as a Christianized Ubuntu. Tutu's TRC was given the limited 2-year mandate to hear allegations of human rights abuses between the 1st of March 1990, the month of the Sharpeville Massacre, to the 10th of May 1994, the date of Mandela's inauguration. This was a painfully inadequate 44-year time limit on the history or on injustice in a country where Dutch conquest of the Cape in 1652 is the genesis of centuries of genocide, slavery, indenture, and land dispossession. Cape Dutch slavery is the womb of 42 years of racial terror that nominally ended with the fall of apartheid. We cannot begin to address apartheid's master-slave relations, or master-servant relations rather, without addressing master-slave relations of the Cape. And yet, the TRC disregarded them. This is despite the fact that African jurisprudence declares, "Icala aliboli," a crime does not rot. In other words, because Ubuntu operates across time and space, a person is a person through those who have come before us, those who come with us, and those who come after us. There is no time limit for injured persons or their descendants to approach the court of law for justice, redress, and reparations. Ubuntu's demand for restorative justice therefore holds no statute of limitations. And yet, by limiting the period of redress to 44 years, the TRC denied the specific centrality and historicity of slavery in the formation of South African society. As early as 1958, on the 28th of March, the Amersfoort arrived with the first shipment of slaves to the Cape of Good Hope. 147 enslaved Angolan children. Almost 7 weeks later, the Hasselt arrived with 228 enslaved people from Dahomey. From 1652 until the British captured the Cape, for the second time in 1805, the Dutch imported at least 63,000 souls from all over the Indian Ocean basin, from Africa's east coast right up until the Indonesian archipelago. Not included in this number is the number of indigenous Africans conquered and enslaved by the Free Burger commandos legally authorized to wage wars of conquest and conduct slave raids through the Imbukistal system. By disregarding these foundational terrors and circumscribing them to 44 years, the TRC was in fact not bound by African jurisprudence, but by a Christianized Ubuntu, as Busak rightly asserted. Thus, without the right or without the mandate to right the historic conquest of land and its peoples, Tutu's impossible task as the head of the TRC was to wield a Christianized Ubuntu to reconcile black and white South Africa into a single nation he called God's rainbow people. Apartheid's victims wanted the truth. 1 million black viewers made the weekly TRC special report the highest rated public affairs broadcast at the time. Apartheid's beneficiaries refused to confront the truth. Few white South Africans watched TRC special report, and white radio listeners objected to TRC broadcasts and caused a rescheduling to a time after 8 p.m., open quote, when most of the farmers are not listening, close quote. Apartheid's architects refused to repent. Apartheid-era President P.W. Botha declared, open quote, "I only apologize for my sins before God," close quote. If white South Africa did not repent or make themselves humble, it was surprised by and grateful for the lack of so-called bitterness or vengeance shown toward them by black South Africans. Beyers Naudé, a Dutch reform minister who was one of the few Afrikaners to publicly oppose apartheid, declared, "In some incredible way, God has shown the seeds of a gracious attitude, of the spirit of Ubuntu in the hearts and minds of the whole African community." Naudé's seeming awe at the seeming miraculousness of the transition revealed some of the ways in which even the most sincere, committed part of white South Africa has failed to reckon with what the radical ethical demands of Ubuntu requires of them to have meaningful reconciliation with us black people. As black people, we ask, Nixolisa Ngani, with what are you apologizing? Because it is understood you do not say sorry with your mouth. The material makes manifest the spirit of intent. Reparations enfleshes the spirit of atonement in our material world. Ubuntu holds that ukuhlawula, praying reparations for injuries caused to others, is indivisible from ukubuyisa, the restoration of injured relations. Ubuntu demands costly forgiveness. You cannot receive forgiveness without giving up something as an act of your contrition. So we ask again, with what are you apologizing? Reckoning with Ubuntu as the basis of African jurisprudence and restorative justice is to take seriously the centrality of ihlawulo yokubuyisa, reparations for the restitution of relations. To be sure, the TRC recommended limited reparations to victims and families who testified. Later, Tutu called for a wealth tax on all white South Africans. The post-apartheid government rejected or ignored both recommendations. White South Africa rejected Tutu's wealth tax. Likewise, they have rejected Black people's calls for land restitution. Today, white South Africans, 9% of the population, hold 72% of the land, while we, Black people, 79% of the population, hold 1%. Just as they have appropriated our land, white South Africa has appropriated Ubuntu as a no man's land and emptied it of its radical ethical demands for restoration through reparation. In a world where the terms of reason, rationality, moral law, consciousness, and history continue to be dictated by our former enslavers and colonizers, the Black demand for reparation and restoration remains unreasonable and irrational and conflated with retribution and vengeance. In other words, the Black demand for reparations remains unthinkable in this world. In the terms of this world, radical African restorative justice remains the law of the slaves, and we continue to be dictated by the law of the masters. In light of these unequal terms of engagement, we consider the Dutch Prime Minister's December 19th apology for the Netherlands' historic role in the slave trade. We ask the Dutch state, Nixolisa Ngani, with what are you apologizing? The Dutch apology for slavery is a sorry one. The Dutch apology for slavery is a sorry of the mouth. Hands empty, except for the offer of a 200 million euro fund for museums and institutions to raise awareness about the legacy of slavery. We ask, what is 200 million euros for the centuries of economic, political, social, and spiritual crimes committed against our people? What is 200 million euros from the bloodied purse of the beneficiaries of the Dutch slave trading golden age? What is 200 million euros in an economy worth more than 894 billion euros? To be sure, the mathematicians or the accountants here can help us. 200 million euros accounts for less than 0.02% of the Dutch GDP. This insulting offer for reflections does not even account for 1%, let alone 0.5%, of the billions built on the blood of the enslaved. Again, we ask, Nixolisa Ngani, with what are you apologizing? We ask, what is the meaning of an apology forced down the throats of the descendants of the enslaved and the colonized? To start, the Dutch state ignored the request for the apology to be made by the Dutch king himself. That the Dutch Prime Minister then chose to make the apology on the 19th of December last year and disregard the request for the apology to be made on Kitikoti, the 150th year anniversary of the abolition of the Dutch slavery on the 1st of July 2023, is a grave insult. To add salt to the wound, the Prime Minister did not seek the organized input and support of the Caribbean, nor did he acknowledge or seek the organized input of the many African countries who also suffered at their bloodied hands. Be it the West and Central African countries, such as Ghana and Angola, whose Atlantic coasts bear the scars of at least 10 Dutch slave forts, nor Mozambique and Madagascar, whose kidnapped peoples were shipped all over the Indian Ocean basin, nor South Africa, where the Dutch enslaved at least 63,000 people. We must view the unilateralism of the Dutch apology for slavery as a statement of intent. The former master will continue to dictate the terms of reconciliation to the former slave. Our former enslavers will discipline us into the regime of compulsory forgiveness and reconciliation without reparation. Without reparation, our enslavers will continue to inherit and benefit from their crime. We ask again, Nixolisa Ngani, with what are you apologizing? We must remember that this former enslaver's refusal to give us reparations is not unique. Our British Caribbean counterparts have repeatedly suffered the insult of regrets for slavery offered by the former Dutch Prime Minister or former British Prime Minister David Cameron and Prince William on visits to Jamaica and King Charles on a visit to Barbados. On his 2005 trip to Jamaica, Cameron delivered his infamous "Let's Move On" speech. In it, he announced that Britain would spend $38 million in foreign aid to build a prison in Jamaica. A prison, mind you, to be filled with deported Jamaicans who had committed crimes in Britain. Rightly, our Jamaican brothers and sisters did not disgrace our ancestors and roundly rejected the British insult. In 2010, French President Nicolas Sarkozy, infamous for his Hegelian remark that Africa has fallen off the map of history, offered an aid and debt cancellation package to Haiti. This was just 7 years after Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide demanded that France pay Haiti over $21 billion, the then equivalent of the 90 million gold francs Haiti was forced to pay Paris after winning its freedom from enslavement. It is no mistake that Haiti, which stayed the first successful slave rebellion, became the first and only nation to pay reparations to its former masters and their descendants for generations. No sooner had Aristide demanded reparations than France and the United States staged a coup against him. We must be clear. The Black demand for reparations is impossible within the terms of this world order. In August 2020, Namibia officially rejected the paltry $12 million that Germany offered for executing the 20th century's first Holocaust during the 1904 to 1908 colonial war against the Nama and Ova Herero people. Namibia rejected the offer not only because the sum is insulting, but because post-Nazi Germany had refused to name the genocide of close to 100,000 people a genocide. Further, they refused to name the reparations reparations. Instead, they named them healing the wounds. By 2021, Namibian protest eventually compelled Germany to name it a genocide and offer an apology. However, Germany has still refused to offer reparations. Instead, it has offered financial aid of $1.34 billion. What does it tell us when post-Nazi Germany, the world's poster child for repentance and reparations for the Jewish Holocaust, cannot be compelled to pay reparations for its Black Holocaust of Nama and Herero people? the ongoing refusal of post-Nazi Germany, the global exemplar for reparations, to pay reparations for its sins against Black people, forces us to confront a more terrifying revelation about the modern world: race, reparations, and anti-Blackness. As one German historian confessed, reparations payments to Namibia could set a precedent for Belgium and the Congo, France and Algeria, or Great Britain and the history of the slave trade. Descendants of the Herero and Nama know that too, close quote. And so does South Africa, and so does the Netherlands, and so does the world. Again, we must be clear. Black reparations are impossible within the terms of this world order. If slavery is the material, metaphysical womb of the modern world, reparations will require nothing less than the world's end. Our former enslavers and colonizers know this all too well. Undoubtedly, if a reparation agreement were to be reached for crimes against Black people in the mold of the 1952 agreement between Germany and Israel to compensate for the Holocaust, reparations would bankrupt and collapse the Western economy. We must therefore confront this terrifying fact: reparations cannot be offered within the terms of this world. A serious call for reparations demands that we liberate ourselves from the fiction that our Black radical traditions are at best derivative of Western historical consciousness, moral law, philosophy, political and epistemological systems, such as the telos of international bourgeois democratic revolution. When our ancestors waged wars of resistance, they waged them based on their historical consciousness of African and Afro-derived political and epistemological paradigms. When, for example, the African National Congress, which had been nonviolent for nearly 50 years, held a meeting in the aftermath of Sharpeville massacre, Nelson Mandela declared his position to the Communist Party leader by invoking Tswana political philosophy, which holds, "Sibatana hasibokwe ka diatla." The attacks of the wild beast cannot be averted with bare hands alone. Raised in the royal Abatembu household, Mandela understood that African political philosophy holds that the question of violence and nonviolence is not one of moral principle, but one of tactics. In that post-Sharpeville moment, Mandela's African historical consciousness saw him argue that, in his words, it was wrong and immoral to subject our people to armed attacks by the state without offering them some kind of alternative, close quote. Importantly, Mandela came of age or political age with the radical Africanist generation of Anton Lembede. This Africanist generation radicalized the ANC in the 50s through firebrand African nationalism, which took its inspiration from the history of nation building and resistance of African sovereigns like King Moshoeshoe and Shaka and Sekukuni in the 19th century. It is with this consciousness of African armed resistance that Mandela became the leader of the ANC's new military wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, the spear of the nation. Importantly, our ancestors did not wage wars of resistance to slavery and colonization as liberal subjects striving for emancipation into the political order of this world. That is, 21st century Western bourgeois. To believe otherwise is a betrayal of our ancestors. When, for example, the Asantes defeated their Dutch enslavers in Berbice, part of contemporary Guyana, in their grand 1763 uprising, they installed their political leader, Kofi, as Asante Hene of the first Afro-Caribbean kingdom. Freed from their masters, the Asantes came together with other formerly enslaved Africans, such as the Creoles, to embed African political and cultural institutions within their kingdom's new governance model. In other words, The historical consciousness of our Black radical traditions demands that the telos of our Black liberation struggle is not inclusion into this world order. Our ancestors did not die for a seat at the table. Rather, emerging from the underside of slaving capitalist modernity, Black radical traditions emanate from the thought that is unthinkable within the terms of a world birthed by transatlantic slavery. Therefore, in this 21st century moment of so-called apologies and acknowledgements, we must think the unthinkable and demand the impossible of this world. We therefore ask our enslavers again, with what are you apologizing? We ask this question of reparations with the full knowledge that the question is unreasonable, the answer unthinkable, and the act impossible in a world birthed by transatlantic slavery. The gift of our own historical memory and consciousness is a freedom from a teleology that dictates that this is the only world possible or even desirable. It gifts us with the understanding that the world that we have is not inevitable or permanent. It is historically contingent and constructed. Armed with ancestral memory, it is up to us to participate in history and to end this world. When we call for the end of the world, we must remember the question posed by Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe at the first meeting of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania in 1959. Asazi ukuthi iyozala nkomoni. We don't know what kind of creature will be birthed. Sobukwe asked this question in relation to the freedom of Africans at home and abroad. Once we are free, what creature will we become? We must ask this question now. Iyozala nkomoni. Once the world is free, what will we become? What our African historical imagination of the future does tell us is that the premise of the new world must be this. Fita homu utware mutu. Directly translated, let the cow pass, grab hold of the person. In other words, uphold people over property. This well-known Southern African political philosophy inspired resistant movements against Black economic and social subjugation and inspired Sobukwe's African Socialist Manifesto. Based in Ubuntu's radical ethics of personhood, Fita homu utware mutu, let go of your cattle, uphold your people, asserts the primacy of the person as a social being and not merely an economic animal. Moreover, if capital, or cattle rather, Freudian slip, moreover, if cattle are the historic center of African material and metaphysical worlds, Fita homu utware mutu demands, let go of the world, uphold your people. Informed by this historical consciousness, Fita homu utware mutu saw our people demand the end of a world birthed by the pursuit of profit so monstrous that it turned African people into property. Today, we demand reparations with the full knowledge that it will be the end of Euro-American capitalist modernity. We know that reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonization will bankrupt the West and collapse its economies. To this we say, Fita homu utware mutu. Let go of your ill-gotten property. Let us uphold our people. We must love ourselves and our ancestors and our unborn enough to end this world. We must continue to demand the impossible of this world and ask, Nixolisa Ngani, with what are you apologizing? Thank you.